Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis. Book review. So this is the first book in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, which I read when I was 28, but which is one of those books I've been meaning to read for like forever, ever since childhood. So I grew up in a very predominant Christian home and attended kind of private Christian schools and Sunday school and all that. And if you've grown up in that community, you know how much C.S. Lewis is revered in these communities, both for kind of his theological works, but also he wrote a lot of fiction. Obviously, the most famous is Chronicles of Narnia, which is a fantasy series he wrote for children, but he also wrote a science fiction series for adults. You know, kind of space travel and Mars and aliens and kind of all that. And I found out about these as a child. I think my mom actually had these books on her bookshelf. And I was like, oh, cool. You know, like the guy who wrote the Narnia series also has a space trilogy. And I was a huge science fiction geek, you know, when I was young. Although, like a lot of people, I was a lazy science fiction geek, meaning I much preferred comic books and cartoons and TV shows than kind of reading kind of the harder books. So I picked up C.S. Lewis's space trilogy at some points in my childhood. I toy with kind of the first few chapters, but I never actually read the whole thing. But then as an adult, I decided, right, I'm going to come through it and I'm going to read C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. So, interestingly enough, C.S. Lewis begins the book by acknowledging his debt to H.G. Wells, the work of H.G. Wells, science fiction. Now, this is interesting because they were on totally opposite sides of the political spectrum. Or at least the religious spectrum. H.G. Wells was kind of famous as an atheist and a socialist and kind of spent a lot of time criticizing religion. And of course, C.S. Lewis was a religious writer. So it's a little bit interesting that C.S. Lewis is kind of beginning the book by acknowledging Wells, but you know, he's not endorsing Wells' atheistic views, he's just acknowledging his debt to Wells' literary books. And fair enough, and you know, good on C.S. Lewis for being big enough to kind of acknowledge Wells, even though Wells has a different worldview. It does also strike me, though, that even though H.G. Wells and C.S. Lewis had different philosophies, I think their style of narration is similar. So in both of these books, the voice of the narrator is very strong. This is interesting. I haven't read the Narnia books in years. So maybe somebody could remind me about what the Narnia books was like. But I do remember I was recently kind of reading those Harry Potter books. And for all, you know, people complain about Harry Potter, this and that and stuff like that. But the books do have a certain charm to them. And what's interesting is how much of the plot is kind of carried through by the dialogue. You know, as the characters are talking to each other, the important plot points will emerge, which is kind of a contrast to, I think, fantasy or narrative books from 100 years ago, 50 years ago, where the narrator would just kind of basically tell you what was going on. C.S. Lewis's book is a lot more kind of the narrator telling you what was going on. I found this a bit jarring at first since I hadn't been used to it. I mean, it's been years since I read the Narnia books. But as I stuck with the book, I did begin to get used to it. Now, speaking of the Narnia books, I think, like a lot of children, I enjoyed the Narnia series first as fantasy, and then only later realized the religious symbolism in them. I remember being on the playground once with a friend, And they were telling me, he said, did you know that the, Aslan is supposed to represent Jesus and blah, 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 blah. And it's so obvious when somebody points it out to you, of course. And probably from an adult perspective, maybe it would have been obvious all along. But from a kid, I didn't get it. That's the thing about C.S. Lewis. His themes, I don't know if you could call them subtle, because like from an adult perspective, it probably is obvious. But it's not overbearing either. It's not like the Left Behind series, where he's kind of going on this polemic rant against kind of like, the non-Christians or something like that. He's got certain themes he's exploring, but he doesn't get preachy. The other interesting thing about Lewis is he's not, at least in this book, he's not interested in the culture war aspect of religion. Like he's not interested in kind of saying, this philosophy is bad. Actually, sorry, that does come through a little bit at the end. There is kind of a big speech at the end. But he's also kind of exploring some philosophical questions. For example, I don't know if anyone has any similar memories, but I remember kind of growing up in Sunday school, and classic kid in Sunday school, right? You always have all these questions the Sunday school teacher just doesn't know how to answer. I think that's not just me. I think that's kind of any kid ever. One of the questions that used to occur to me, which probably has occurred to a lot of kids over the years, was if there is life on other planets, if kind of there are aliens out there, what is their relationship to total depravity? I mean, like when Adam and Eve ate that apple, did that affect only just Earth? Was original sin only on Earth? Or did that affect the whole universe? Did other planets have their own Garden of Eden and their own... that was actually a question I asked once in Sunday school. Well, it turns out C.S. Lewis thought about this question years before I did, because it's something that is a major part in this book. If there is life on other planets, did they experience sin? Are they still in the kind of Golden Age Garden of Eden period? If they are still in the Golden Age Garden of Eden period, then what would happen if they ever interacted with our Earth? The other thing, Lewis just gets interested in the question of how do angels talk? Which is a kind of thing any other writer would just kind of say, well, of course, they're angels, they appear, they talk. But, Lewis says, well, wait a minute. If they're spiritual beings, how do they make sound? Because sound waves are manipulated by physical objects. So there's this whole explanation in this book about how angels can talk. Like, we didn't really need it. He could have just said, like, the angels are talking. But, it's one of those, it just shows kind of Lewis has got, like, one of those intriguing philosophical brains. Now, as far as the plot of this book, there's not much. A man goes to Mars. He sees many interesting things. He learns about an alien race, and then he comes back. But there is a certain wonder at a new world lived through the eyes of the main character, kind of seeing all this kind of new planets through the main character. Of course, it's also nothing new for science fiction fans. We've seen it many, many times in a lot of different books and movies. The thing is, though, this is only the first book in the series. It's a trilogy. So I'm assuming that this book is just kind of setting up for stuff that's going to happen in the rest of the trilogy. And in fact, there's an afterword where Lewis pretty much says as much, like there's more stuff to come. Another little interesting thing, while I'm kind of nitpicking the details, is some of the language in this book. Because C.S. Lewis uses a lot of casual swear words. He doesn't actually say them himself, but his characters do. So things like damn and hell uses exclamations. Also, God and Lord, like, oh Lord, used as an exclamation. Now this is interesting because at my Christian school, we would get in trouble for that. Now, I mean, granted, in today's day and age, these are very mild profanities. But, in my Christian community, we got in trouble for that. You couldn't say damn or hell, and you couldn't use any kind of reference to the divinity as an exclamation. You couldn't say, oh God, or oh Lord. That was taking God's name in vain. And Lewis isn't actually saying it himself, his characters are. But like if I was in creative writing in 8th grade in my conservative Christian school, I couldn't have had my characters say, oh God. So, yeah, I don't know what's going on here. Standards have changed maybe, or maybe this is an example of the difference between kind of English Christianity, British Christianity, and kind of the more conservative brand of American Christianity, or I don't know. It definitely caught my interest though, especially given how revered C.S. Lewis is in modern day Protestant America. I wish I had read this book back when I was a kid. I could have had some interesting arguments with my Christian school teachers about the use of language. Okay, that's all I've got on this one.